Welcome to the God Course. Well, this is the third session that we are together looking at these big questions of God and our place in the universe. And where we left off last time was seeing that Jesus made great effort to teach us what the human problem actually is. But he did that so that we could really understand the solution. And the good news is, that's what this week's session is all about. Christianity is officially the most persecuted religion in the world. One of the major reasons for that is because people in general just hate hearing that they're sinners. It's very unpopular to talk about sin, the idea that we are doing things that God doesn't like, and that God is a judge of wrongdoing. And yet, however unpopular these ideas are, we can't ignore that they formed a large part of the teaching of Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus wasn't afraid to talk about sin and to talk about judgment and to talk about things that were rather politically incorrect, and that's one of the reasons he got into so much trouble. But he wanted to help you and me to understand what our heart problem is, because then we would listen to the solution. But the solution that he then came to bring was so drastic that it was something that even his own disciples couldn't accept at first. Listen to what he says and what their response is. Jesus went out with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They answered him, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." "But you," he asked them, "who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he strictly warned them not to tell anyone about him. Now, up to this point, the disciples had no problem with what Jesus was saying. In fact, what they had just discovered was epic. Jesus standing in front of them was the Messiah that Israel had been waiting for centuries. Now, the Messiah was a figure spoken of in the Old Testament prophets who were inspired by God and themselves were given certain signs of authority so that the people knew that their words were from God, and that's why they're in the Bible's Old Testament. But these prophets spoke of a king to come, who they called the Anointed One or the Messiah. And this king was going to come and rule God's people in a good and benevolent rule where he would provide for them and where he would defeat all of their enemies. But this rule, this kingdom that this Messiah was going to establish, wasn't just a kingdom based in the Middle East. It eventually was a kingdom that was going to cover this whole world and include people from every tribe and tongue and culture and nation, all living under God's good rule in the society that he always intended for humans to live in. And this Messiah was a key person to make this kingdom established on earth. And Jesus had indeed proven that he was the Messiah, because so many of these prophecies, even down to the small details of his life and his birthplace and his lineage, were perfectly fulfilled. And so there was no doubt by this stage that Jesus was the Messiah, and his disciples could clearly see that. And that's why they say, "You are the Messiah." But there were also many others who missed that, who had the same information but refused to admit that Jesus was the Messiah, because he wasn't the Messiah they were expecting. They were expecting a conquering king, and here comes a lowly carpenter. And that's why many people still who are expecting the Jewish Messiah today don't realize that he's already come, because he just was totally unexpected the way he came and who he was. But interestingly enough, that was also predicted by the prophets, that he would come to earth the first time humbly, and that he would be rejected even by his own people, and many other details that the prophet said had come true so far in his life. Okay, so at this point in the story, the disciples have realized who he is. But what they still haven't grasped is how he is going to rescue his people from their enemies and who their enemy actually is. Listen to what he says next. Then he began to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed, and rise after 3 days. He spoke openly about this. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." And so Jesus said that Peter had in mind the things of men, not the things of God. And he used a very strong rebuke. He said, it's exactly what Satan wants you to think. And so he personified Satan as being right there in Peter's mind, influencing him not to think according to God's agenda, but to think according to man's agenda. And man's agenda was that the Messiah was going to come, conquer the enemies of the Palestinian territories, much like the Jews still are waiting for today, and to secure security for Israel through political and military means. But then we realize actually that's not what God's agenda was all along. When God said that he was going to send someone to defeat Israel's enemies and protect them and provide for them, he was actually referring to a much more powerful enemy than the Palestinians or the Iranians or the Romans of that day. He was referring to the enemy of sin in our hearts that Jesus taught us, we saw last week, is something that is the root cause of our problem and the root cause of human conflict. And so Jesus had actually come to liberate people from sin and death itself. And the very unexpected way he was going to overcome sin and death was by himself going to die. You see, and this really gets to the heart of who Jesus was and what he had come to do on this earth. Because while the things of men involve liberation through violence and fighting, as we've seen through thousands of years of human history, the things of God provide liberation through means of willing sacrifice. Question is, though, how does Jesus dying, like he said he was going to do, actually help anything? How does that liberate people from the effects of sin and death? Well, to answer that question, we actually need to fast forward to the moment Jesus died and see exactly what happened on that fateful day. I'm going to read from Mark chapter 15, and I'm going to read it in its entirety so we really get the impact of what's happening here. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then they crucified him and divided his clothes, casting lots for them to decide what each would get. Now it was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge written against him was, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 criminals with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by were yelling insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha! The one who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself by coming down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests with the scribes were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross so that we may see and believe." Even those who were crucified with him taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which is translated, my God, why have you abandoned me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "See, he's calling for Elijah." Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, fixed it on a stick, offered him a drink, and said, "Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down." Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who was standing opposite him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Now, there are two very significant things that we need to pick up from that story. In fact, a lot of things happened there, and a number of those details, in fact, were specific fulfillments of prophets hundreds of years earlier, which couldn't have been engineered, just to, again, emphasize the point that all of this was happening according to God's prearranged, predetermined plan. But there's two things that I want you to see in this story, what happened on that day, so that we can really understand the significance of it and how it actually solves the problem of human sin. Now, the first thing that we see happened on this day was that God was angry. Now, this is not the first time or the last time that God gets angry. And God's anger is not like human anger. God's anger is justified, and it is pure, and it is holy, and it is the right response to human evil and towards everything that opposes God's good plans for his world. And when God's anger meets with human sin, very often it's accompanied by the physical sign of darkness. Any reader of the Old Testament would have picked up the fact that this darkness, like it had many times before, is a sign that God is angry. And so when we read verse 33, we start to understand what's happening. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At noon, when the sun should have been at its highest point and at its brightest of the day, darkness descends on the whole land. And we know actually from the time of the year that this couldn't have been some solar eclipse. This was a supernatural event, and it was designed to tell us one thing, that God was angry. Now, you'd think God is angry because a whole bunch of people are unjustly murdering his son. You'd expect that after this darkness lifts, those people will be dealt with and wiped out and killed. But actually, when the darkness lifts, only one person has died. See, the unexpected thing about what's happening here is that not only is God angry, but that anger seems to be directed at Jesus, because Jesus is abandoned. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, there's no doubt that Jesus suffered intense physical agony on the cross. But here we read about something even more agonizing than all of that. And that was for Jesus, the Son of God, to experience the spiritual agony of being completely cut off from God, his Father. Having God, the creator and sustainer of everything, completely forsake you is something no human should wish on another. Jesus once said to his disciples, "God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." While many people may feel abandoned by God, the fact that we draw breath and have rain and warmth from the sun shows that he hasn't totally abandoned anyone. As the apostle says, he is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. Except now, on the cross, God has truly abandoned a human being like he had never done before. So as we read this account of that fateful day that Jesus died, we discover two things. We discover that God was angry and he was pouring out that anger on that day. But we also discover that Jesus was abandoned. Even though Jesus never sinned, God's anger was being directed to him. Jesus on the cross was experiencing God's rightful and just wrath for human sin, and he was absorbing that like a lightning rod there on the cross himself. And that was always the plan. See, he had previously told his disciples, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. A ransom for many. A ransom is something that was paid at the slave markets of the ancient world to liberate slaves from captivity. And so by Jesus calling himself a ransom, he is saying that his life was a payment of exchange to liberate his people from the captivity of sin. But that's not the end of the story. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they could go and anoint him. Very early in the morning on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb at sunrise. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance to the tomb for us?" Looking up, they noticed that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white, sitting on the right side. They were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he told them. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they put him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you." They went out and ran from the tomb because trembling and astonishment overwhelmed them, and they said nothing to anyone, since they were afraid. They were trembling and bewildered. Nobody expected this. And yet listen to what Jesus had told his disciples time and time again. He began to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed, and rise after 3 days. For he was teaching his disciples and telling them the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after he is killed, he will rise 3 days later. But they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. Taking the 12 aside again, he began to tell them the things that would happen to him. "See, we are going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him, and he will rise after 3 days." The resurrection of Jesus is one of the most historically verifiable ancient events in all of history, and God made sure of that. In fact, as one British Chief Justice writes of the account of the resurrection of Jesus, "In its favor as a living truth, there exists such overwhelming evidence, positive and negative, factual and circumstantial, that no intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in the verdict that the resurrection story is true." The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the central event to everything else that happens in the Bible, because not only does it prove the words of Jesus true, and that his death does pay a ransom for human sins, yours and mine, and not only does it prove that thousands of years worth of prophecy are true, but the resurrection of Jesus Christ shows us and proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that God's plan for human beings is not for us to die and rot in a grave. God made us to live and enjoy him forever in a new restored creation that he has always planned for this planet. And Jesus came to make that possible for each one of us. Now, I know this is all pretty profound stuff. The question is, what do we do with this information? How do we respond to it? Well, that is what our final session next week will cover. I'll see you then.